Thank you for the invitation to join you today. I do really appreciate it. I think that what a lot of folks in the United States do not realize is that October was the reaction to something, not the beginning of something. And as one of the speakers had mentioned earlier, this is not a difficult subject. You don't have to be a political scientist or understand international humanitarian law. If the blockade was not in place for the past 17 to 18 years, October 7th would not have happened. If the Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank had not been under a military occupation for the last almost 60 years now, October 7th wouldn't happen. But the Israeli government continues to oppress the populations both in the Gaza Strip and the occupied West Bank to make the conditions almost unlivable. A military order is supposed to be a temporary military tactic, but the Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank, they've been living under that military order since 1967. So, the Israeli government uses the excuse that these things are put in place for security reasons. So you may be able to argue some of that as far as the restriction of movement or maybe large protests, but some of the military orders are as ridiculous as what you can plant on your own land. So I'm not sure how in that sort of space what difference it makes if you're planting roses or hydrangeas or tomatoes or cucumbers. This is not a military issue, but this is the way that the Israeli government is implementing the military orders on the Palestinians. Another thing that I don't think that the American population truly understands is that when we talk about the Palestinian populations, that includes the Christian populations that are living in those spaces. From If you listen to some of the cities that they are talking about on the news, they're talking about Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, Jericho. You know, these are cities that come from our Bible stories in the Christian faith, and there is still a significant amount of Christians that are living in the occupied West Bank and in the Gaza Strip that are affected by the apartheid state that Israel has been implementing. In addition to that, I think it's also important to note who is primarily being affected. So if we look at the numbers of the casualties that took place on October 7th, yes, there was loss of life on both sides. There were Israeli soldiers and citizens that were killed in the attack, but those numbers have not moved nearly as significantly as the numbers on the Palestinian side. And also with the Palestinians, the people that are being mostly affected by these constant bombardments and these brutal attacks are civilians. The Israelis are not attacking as much as they want us to believe that it's Hamas. They're not attacking soldiers on a battleground. The targets that they are hitting are schools, hospitals, refugee camps, mosques, and churches. And these are places where you'll find civilian populations. So the vast majority of the people, upwards of 70%, that have died since October 7th, 2023, are women and children. I myself, I'm based out of Florida in the United States, and we have had a number of doctors and nurses that have done tours around the state to talk about their experience as they were in Gaza over the past year and a half, and they're talking about children coming on with war wounds coming in with children, and this is what they're experiencing. And the Israeli government is again, like the rhetoric that's coming out of Israel and that we're hearing on the Western news is that they are attacking Hamas, they are attacking soldiers or militants, which we can see is not necessarily the case. which is upsetting because we know even prior to October 7th, the Israeli government was getting $3.8 billion in aid, and most of that is coming in the form of military aid. So that's what the Israeli government was using to oppress the Palestinians, both in the Gaza Strip and in the occupied West Bank. And that was prior to this current genocide. So what do we do when they're they're not using the weapons? It's a silly word. It's a silly concept to think that like they're using weapons appropriately because it's still killing people. But when they're not using them and abiding by international humanitarian law, what do? We give them more. Which again, from a civilian standpoint, like that's ridiculous. The Israeli government is being backed by one of the strongest nations in the world with the most sophisticated weapons. And like I said, they're using that as to perpetrate the ongoing blockade and the occupation in the occupied West Bank. So they have all this technology and they can't get their house in order. They have all this technology and they can't determine what is a military target versus a civilian location. And again, like I said, what does the U.S. government do in reaction to that? We give them more weapons. But I will say that here in the United States, this is the government that is continuing to allow this to happen. If you are looking at folks on the ground and looking in your communities here in the United States, people are fed up. They're done. Thanks to social media, it's very, very unfortunate that it is at the cost of tens of thousands of people losing their lives, and that's including, like I said, including children. But the civilians here in the United States, the average citizen is able to see what's happening as this genocide has unfolded on the ground in real time because of social media. So we don't have to rely on the misinformation or the lack of information that's coming from the Western media, because we can see how things are happening as they're unfolding on the ground in Gaza. And that has really started to push the average citizen to start and go speak to their elected officials and speak to them and let them know that this is not how we want to be represented on the world stage. So I actually work with a number of different organizations here in the U.S. And what we're doing is we are trying to educate the population because, like I said, a lot of people don't know what's happening. You know, we're in our own little bubble over here, and also in addition to that, we're not given what the true picture. You know, we hear that Israel is our ally and Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Like, how can you operate as a democracy when you are an apartheid state and now you're committing genocide? Like these are not how democracies these are not how democracies work. So more and more people are becoming more educated on what's happening. And we are the organizations here, we are in the process of teaching. We're going out into our communities, whether it be a faith-based community, school-based communities. We're on campuses. We're teaching our people to go out and speak to their members of Congress, because there are things in the legislation that could potentially stop the United States to feeding this genocide. So we're asking them to go out and support joint resolutions of disapproval. So the Israeli government is not getting this blank check of weapons, and also to continue to support the United Nations, because the Palestinians were experiencing the lack of basic necessities before this recent genocide started. So in 2022, Amnesty International put out a report calling the Israeli government an apartheid state, and in part of that report, it stated that with the blockade in Gaza, that they were calculating how many calories an individual would need to survive, not to live and thrive, but just enough to keep them alive. And that, based on the number of the population in Gaza, that's what they were sending in as aid. So you weren't getting access to clean and you weren't getting they weren't getting access to enough food. They weren't getting access to enough clean and safe water. Um, um, Medical equipment. And also, this is not the first time that the population of Gaza has been under attack from the Israeli government. There's been a number of different of wars that have happened since the blockade has been in place. And with that, the Israeli government also does not allow the appropriate materials and construction equipment to come in and rebuild. So the Gaza Strip was already a place that's not very livable to begin with. In fact, the UN had put out a report in 2012 and said if the conditions in the Gaza Strip do not improve by 2020, that the Gaza Strip would be unlivable. And since that time, just between 2012 and 2020, there were conflicts. And now here we are in 2025, and we've watched a genocide unfold over the past 16 months. So we can only imagine the conditions that the Gazans are living under right now under the genocide and the blockade. And now we hear that that they've stopped more resources going in as far as food and water. So so I think it's very important to for the Western nations, for the individuals, the people that are in power. We need to start having more frequent and serious conversations with our elected officials and let them know that if they are not willing to be on the right side of history, then we will vote them out and put somebody else that will.